So for those who don't know me, my name's Michael Fitzgerald, also known on Twitter as stoic.xmr. So tonight's presentation is called, I suppose it's based on a book I wrote called The Monero Standard, right? But funnily enough, the Monero Standard is not really about Monero. It's actually about two concepts that totally transform society as we see it. So the book, The Monero Standard, is really about how we can use money to build a long-lasting platform for both freedom and prosperity. And how we do that, we're going to explore that here. So I suppose, in a nutshell, right, like in order to solve any problem in the world, you first need to understand what the problem actually is. So the first problem, and I just want to emphasize that what we talk about tonight is really only a short version of what we actually talk about. There's actually so many more factors you need to understand. For example, a lot of you guys who have been in crypto for a while, you try to explain it to somebody new, and it's very hard to explain something like Bitcoin to people who don't understand things like economics, like technology, like history, and many more subjects, right? So it really comes together. You need to bring a lot of areas together in order to understand what the problem is and obviously what the solution is. So the first problem, as many guys, possibly that's the reason why you're here. That's maybe how you even got into, let's call it Bitcoin or crypto in the first place, into digital money, right? Is the fiat Ponzi. So the fiat Ponzi, also known as the monetary system, the problem with that is we have the arbitrary control and obviously the arbitrary devaluation of money in society today. So one point that I really like to hammer home is something I call time theft, right? A lot of you guys might be familiar with this concept, time theft. So when you actually think about it at its core, you go to work, you spend your caloric energy, you spend your time, right? In order to obtain a resource, being money, being dollars, right? So you go to work, obviously. Then over time, the government, the reserve banks, obviously the Fed in America, they expand the monetary supply arbitrarily. And what they're doing is they're passing that purchasing power from you onto them. So what they're doing is they're stealing that time that you've spent and giving it to themselves. And another concept I like to talk about a lot is proof of work. These are actually the two main concepts of the book, is proof of work and privacy. So the significance of this is that money no longer requires proof of work. So when you think about the value of everything in this world, right? The value of everything is obviously based on supply and demand, but it's based on how much work is required to create more of it. How much work is required, right? That's why things like gold and diamonds are much more expensive than beers, for example, because it requires a lot more work to obtain gold and to obtain diamonds than it does like a beer, for example, or like dirt. So the significance of this, there's no limitation on the creation of money. Since they essentially have a printer, it requires very little work in order to create more of it. And the outcome of this is not only the distortion of reality through markets and outcomes being manipulated, but every empire in history, every nation, every country in history that's gone on to a fiat money, which is money by decree. It's not money that actually has value. It's money because the government has decreed it on you. And the outcome of every nation that's adopted that has always been a collapse, right? From the far before the Roman Empire to recently, say, like the Dutch Empire, the Spanish Empire, etc., etc. The British Empire. So when we look at the fiat Ponzi, to really illustrate all of this, right? So we have the M2 monetary supply, which to sum it up is things like cash, things like bank deposits, and a few other things, but let's just keep it simple at that. So 1971, can I just get a show of hands? Who actually knows what happened in 1971? A few of you guys? Okay, cool. So for those who don't know, what happened in 1971, the dollar used to be backed by gold. So that's what actually gave the dollar value. The dollar was just an easier means to transfer value to someone because you can't divide gold. You can't really pay for a Mars bar in gold, for example. So you got a paper certificate from the bank and that was redeemable for gold. That's why the dollar had value. So in 1971, they got rid of the convertibility, as they call it, to gold. So the dollar, as it is today, is worth absolutely nothing besides the paper it's printed on. You can't redeem anything for it. And as you can see with the M2 monetary supply, back in 1971, where I've started the chart, it was around about $800 billion. And by the way, this is an old chart. So this is what, 2023? Start of 2023, I had this chart up. And it's obviously, actually, to be honest, it's around about the same level as where this chart ends, but it's over $20 trillion today. So a significant increase in the monetary supply. And that's all because money has become far too easy to create. There's very little work required in creating more of it. And as a consequence of the, massive expansion of the monetary supply, we're seeing what we see even today and what we've really seen a lot over the last few years, which is a significant devaluation of purchasing power. So you guys are not blind. Obviously politicians, you hear on the propaganda in the media, it's Putin's fault, it's everybody's fault except their own as to why inflation, it's corporate greed, it's everything, right? But the reality is that the price of everything is supply and demand, right? So when they're increasing the supply of dollars and the demand is staying the same, it requires more dollars because there is more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services as there was before. So as a result of this, we see purchasing power being massively reduced. And by the way, I just want to emphasize, this is based on CPI numbers, not on realistic numbers. So CPI is complete bullshit, as I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware. And so even by CPI, you need $6.46 today for every dollar you had back in 1971, which is when this chart started. And by the way, even seasoned investors would probably get those returns. But the point is that you have to gamble your money and become a part-time investor just in order to not lose purchasing power, in order to be stolen from less. And as I say, this means they steal your life, since money is a storage of energy. When you actually think about wealth, for example, wealth is wealth is not money. Money is actually just a means by which you store your energy until you're ready to consume it. And wealth is goods and services, right? So you're going to end up consuming goods and services. So by arbitrarily increasing and decreasing the supply, they obviously steal your life, as we spoke about before. We spoke about money no longer requiring proof of work. There's obviously no limitation to the creation of money and the devaluation of it. And another important point, these are probably the three most important points in terms of the monetary system that is very important to be remembered. So the third point in all of that is the fiat system has created a system based on complete moral hazard, right? So when you actually think about the consequences of decisions in general, you have a politician, he goes out, he starts a war in Afghanistan, they waste money on stimmies, doing what, blah, 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 right? One of the million decisions this year alone, let alone all of history, in which they waste money. So those who are making the decisions are completely detached from the consequences of them. Because traditionally, in order to obtain money, you have to provide value to somebody else, right? And so what they do when they print money is they're able to make bad decisions and bail their way out of it. You're actually the one paying for their bad decisions, not only through taxation, but through the permanent theft of your money. So beyond this, the only question in regards to the fiat Ponzi is it going to turn around, right? So the trend's very clear. So back in around 1965, the federal debt's GDP, I don't know the exact number, but it's below $1 trillion there. I think it's around $600 billion, which is still a lot of money, by the way. And today, and again, this chart is old. I've got a laser. Maybe not. So as you can see at the end of the chart here, this is old. This is actually from a year ago. And it's, at this point, it's not even over $32 trillion. For those who pay attention, you know that the monetary system, the amount of public debt went over $34 trillion earlier this year, right? An incredible amount of money. So we can see the trend in regards to federal debt, public debt, obviously being the main driver of the expansion of the monetary supply. The trend, as I say in trading, the trend is your friend. And at this point in time, there has been no point. I mean, if you can't see the trend, you probably listen on the radio, you know? So in regards to analyzing some of the key economic indicators in whether the trend's going to turn around, I'm sure a lot of you seasoned crypto guys have seen this chart before. It's the US debt clock, right? So again, this is from around about a year ago. National debt is $31 trillion, now over 34. Important thing to notice is the federal debt to GDP. One incredibly interesting statistic, and I suppose fact from this, is every country in the history of mankind that's gone over 130% debt to GDP has collapsed. And the only exception to that is the countries we have now. Say for, not the US, they're not there yet, but they're well on their way. We have countries that are satirically, if that's the word I'm looking for, jokingly economic powerhouses like Spain, Italy, Portugal, Greece, Japan, who are in serious economic trouble, right? Well on their way to collapse. So just quickly in all of this, if you guys are interested, this is an incredibly interesting website, at least for myself, called US Debt Clock. You can have a look at all these statistics. But some really quick ones in regards to, again, goods and services being wealth, so productivity of those goods and services, is the US workforce here. So in 2000, it was 160 million people. Today was 161.7 million people. And compare that to the people not in the workforce, so consuming without producing, was 81 million, now 99 million. So that's what? That's a 25% increase versus a less than a percent increase. And out of all this data, the most important thing to take out of all this data is the unfunded liabilities, which is down the bottom here. So we saw debt is above 34 trillion now. Unfunded liabilities is $187 trillion. So what are unfunded liabilities? Unfunded liabilities are obviously going to be a big driver of the expansion of the monetary supply, right? And so they're things like, in Australia, it's Medicare, things like pensions for government employees, things that are expected. Again, it's self-explanatory, unfunded liabilities. So liabilities are debts and unfunded are not paid for, essentially. So debts that are not paid for, money that's expected to be paid that they don't know where it's going to come from. So at $187 trillion, that's an incredible waterfall, if you want to call it that, a cliff of money that has to be found that they don't know where it's going to come from. So the only solution to all of this is printing more money. There is no other alternative. There's no realistic way in which you can produce your way out of that amount of debt, right? And anecdotally, when you look in society, are you seeing politicians who are talking about reducing the deficit or reducing spending? Or are you seeing two parties that one's saying we should spend double what we get and one saying we should spend 150% of what we get? There's no rationality to politics anymore. So again, we look at the massive economic problems we have with the only solution being printing more money. Now, the second problem is globalism and technocracy. To sum it up very simply, right? So none of this, by the way, because if you're not familiar with this aspect, certainly if you're not involved in crypto, a lot of this can sound like conspiracy theories, right? But I just want to emphasize that these are things that are not only openly talked about, but also things that are like published on their website, things that they're written books about, for example, things that you find on their social media accounts. So we have things like CBDCs, social credit scores, and digital IDs. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of many of these concepts before, right? So to sum it up very quickly, we have, I suppose, the system by which policy is both created and implemented in society. So a lot of people immediately would think, governments are really in control of what happens within a nation. But it's not that simple. I'm not saying they completely have no influence, but it's certainly not that simple. So can I just get a rough sort of knowledge on who's actually heard of like the Bank of International Settlements before? Okay. So we have at the top, the Bank of International Settlements is so-called the central bank of central banks, right? So we have the BIS and the 64 member central banks that make up the Bank of International Settlements. So the Federal Reserve, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the Bank of Canada, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, the ECB, etc., etc. So these guys come together every year and they determine the monetary policy for the year. And that's, for example, it's no coincidence that we see all the member central banks raising interest rates at the same time and lowering interest rates at the same time, printing money at the same time, etc., etc. Because it is all actually centrally planned. And again, none of this is a conspiracy. This is all on their website, by the way. They have their meeting notes and all that kind of stuff. So below these, you have the global think tanks, like a lot of you guys would know. If you know the BIS, you'd know the World Economic Forum. You may not have heard of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Chatham House, organizations like the Club of Rome, the Bilderberg Conference, etc., etc. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc. So what these guys do is they essentially implement the policies and more or less through, well, at this point I should probably highlight that there is actually a lot of interconnectivity between these layers, right? So you might see members from business going into government, going into the World Bank or the IMF. You might, and obviously central banks around the world. You might see people like Larry Fink from BlackRock being a member for the World Economic Forum, et cetera, et cetera. And you might see, for example, the World Economic Forum, as Klaus Schwab calls it, penetrating cabinets, right? Having the Young Leaders Program like Justin Trudeau, having Jacinta Ardern from New Zealand. I forget his name, but there's an Australian politician who's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. So there is an incredible amount of interconnectivity between these layers. And obviously you have members from government going into these organizations like the UN and the IMF and all these kind of things, right? So in regards to creating and implementing policies, we have these guys, the global think tanks, creating the policies, and through their lobbying and connections, they're able to get them distributed to organizations like the IMF and the UN, for example. And obviously, being a signatory, Australia, for example, or many countries being a signatory to many of the treaties that the UN brings out, many of the organizations like the IMF on anti-money laundering, et cetera, they have to implement a vast majority of these policies. And conveniently, they're already created and they don't have to draw them up themselves. And so that's the intergovernmental organizations, the governments. And below that, I don't think it's some big conspiracy. I think a lot of the way the world works is just a consequence. For example, when you see the birds in the sky, like the birds don't talk about before they fly. They don't think, Larry, you go that way, and John, you go that way, and we'll all follow, right? But what they do is they all react to each other and they all move, for example, in unison in the end. And I think that's what businesses are doing. The businesses are just really reacting to a lot of the legislation, trying to do their fiduciary responsibility and look out for their shareholders and act as well as they can. So they essentially act as an enforcement layer for a lot of these policies without actually meaning to. So in regards to these policies, again, these are the things that these guys, so the BIS, the central banks, the global think tanks, all of these layers, except for the businesses, are talking about implementing these policies. So CBDC has been the first one. So central bank digital currencies, even in Australia, we have a pilot program. In America, they have the FedNow program. In Nigeria country, they have the eNaira. There's many CBDC programs all around the world, if not being developed right now. So we have completely programmable money, what this means. No matter how they try and sell it to you, whether they say it's more efficient, it's easier to use, blah, 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 blah. It's completely programmable money, which means they're able to manipulate, as we see in China today, any aspect they want of the currency. So they can put time limits on your money. So if you don't spend it before this time, either we take it, but probably what's more likely is that they put a negative interest rate. So today you have $100 and tomorrow you have $99 if you don't spend it, for example. You have restrictions on spending areas, say like can't buy X amount of alcohol, for example, or whatever the case, right? And as we see, and they don't even need a CBDC for this last part, you can lose access to your bank for unapproved transactions or unapproved activities, like we saw in Canada with the trucker protests where they kicked them out of the banking system, essentially for protesting against the government's draconian COVID lockdown measures. And obviously you don't need me to explain. This means you lose all your monetary freedom. Money is expression, so you lose your freedom to expression, and you lose, if not already, if stealing a vast majority of your purchasing power wasn't enough already, you quite literally lose your right to store wealth. Digital IDs, I'll just go through this one quickly. So again, we see the digital ID bill is actually, as a matter of fact, being put through the Senate in 2 days from now, I believe, in Australia. So this can come in the form of something like vaccine passports. That's something that's already arguably happening. And obviously we could just go back to revert to Nazi Germany, have movement licenses, etc. But all this is available with the digital ID. And lastly, there are a lot more agendas, a lot more scary dystopian agendas that these organizations are talking about. But the last one we're going to cover today is social credit scores, which can also, by the way, don't be fooled, come in the form of a carbon credit score. So CBDCs and digital IDs pave the way for an effective social or carbon credit score system. And just to cover it off, this could just be ranking you on how good of a citizen you are, what you spend your money on, where you go, who you hang out with, etc., etc. For example, in China, if you buy too much alcohol, that's obviously social credit score goes down. If you have a kid and you buy nappies, social credit score goes up. Basically, complete manipulation of people's behaviors. And so they rank you based on how good of a citizen you are. So those are the two problems that I really want to cover today. But the question is, how do we fix them, right? Obviously, the only solution is the continued devaluation of the fiat monetary system. There is no alternative. And obviously we see, I mean, even ask yourself, I don't even need to convince anybody here. Like, again, you'd have to be blind or just listening to the radio, not to hear, well, I suppose know within yourself, is society, not only in Australia, but around the world, is it becoming more free or less free, right? So obviously the answer is it's becoming less free. So the two solutions to this, the fiat Ponzi is proof of work, which we'll talk about, and to globalism, technocracy, and the lack of freedom is privacy. So as I said, proof of work provides long-lasting prosperity. So we spoke about proof of work before. Obviously the limiting, I suppose, since you're limited by spending real world resources, it actually requires an amount of work or value created somebody in order to obtain Monero. Governments or reserve banks can no longer steal your time, right? So the monetary policy is set in stone. Like gold, for example, you can't just print more gold. Like beers, you can't print more beers. You actually have to produce tangible real world value in order to obtain it. So that means essentially they can't steal your money anymore, which I think is a step forward. And in society, the consequences of decisions, as I spoke about moral hazard, the consequences of decisions are retied to those who make it. So you can't make a bad decision and print your way out of it at everybody else's expense, right? And secondly, privacy provides long-lasting freedom. So essentially, not only is it a more desirable trait, and maybe you guys haven't thought about some of this before, but for example, if you don't think it's a desirable trait, would you publish your bank balance and every transaction you've ever had with the entire world? And if you don't think privacy is important, one thing I always like to say to people is show me your phone. Like, what's the worst thing you've ever said on Messenger? What's the worst photo you have on your phone? Like, of course, privacy is important, right? It's incredibly important and desirable. So it gives you autonomy over your money, again, which, since at its core, money is actually expression, right? You're showing the world, as a consequence of spending money, you're showing the world what you actually value. So, for example, if you go down to the supermarket and buy, well, it doesn't matter, whether you buy steak, vegetables, whatever, right? You're actually showing that you value those things. So when you lose your money, when you lose your ability to spend that, or on the other side of that is you get the ability to spend that, you have that freedom of expression. And obviously, as a consequence, talking about prosperity as well, societies can then build based on the true demands of the people and have economies that don't require third-party approval. So stacking up the cards, really simply, to put a 12-hour rant into about 3 minutes, fiat money is not real money. Number two, the fiat monetary system benefits only those closest to the monetary system. Those who are able, as Millet says, they're able to obtain money today at yesterday's price. And then the last person who receives the money, which is usually people like us who are working, usually people who own businesses, for example, they're receiving the money, say, in the future today at a sort of in the future price, at a much devalued price as compared to when the government gets it or the Reserve Bank gets it. Three, fiat's a Ponzi, obviously. There is no way they can possibly continue the system without, I suppose, in a roundabout way, taking more money from people, like a Ponzi, literally. So as a consequence, an alternative monetary system will be needed. That's just completely indisputable at this point. Dollars are already, I mean, when you look at data in general, looking at it, one piece of data is irrelevant, right? But when you start to analyze that data over a longer period of time, you can start to see the trends. And as an example, the value of, since the Federal Reserve was created in 1915 in America, the value of the American dollar has gone down 99%. So going forward into the future, that's only going to continue to devalue. And so obviously an alternative monetary system is going to be needed. 5, reform cannot change the system, even if fiat wasn't a Ponzi. Because those who can make decisions, i.e. the politicians, the bankers of the world, they're the only ones who lose, number one, and two, they're the ones who lose the most, right? So under no practical circumstance have we ever seen it in history, nor are we ever going to see it in history again. Very unlikely anyway. I know where I'm putting my money in. Number 6 is, and this is something I talk about in the book a lot, at least it has its own chapter dedicated to it, and something we don't really cover here, as there's a lot we don't cover here. But revolutionary cycles are converging to provide a platform for natural change. It's actually an incredibly exciting time that we live in. I often say it's the best time in all of human history to be alive. Number 7 is part of those revolutionary cycles. We have a 50-year technological cycle converging. We had around 50 years ago the invention of the microprocessor. Before that we had, I believe it was steel. Before that we had the engine, etc. The 80-year political social revolution. Again, 80 years ago we saw the rise of populism like Hitler, Mussolini. 80 years before that we saw the American Civil War, etc. And then we have a 250-year empire revolutionary cycle. So 250 years ago, we had the American and French revolutions, which is actually set up, as we see today, the greatest empire in, not even my opinion, but in data, the greatest empire in all history. 250 years before that, we had the Protestant Reformation with the invention of the printing press, the Gutenberg printing press. where Martin Luther went to the church and essentially posted the 95 thesis on the church's door, saying that what they were saying was bullshit, so they no longer required the approval of the state in order to get a translation of anything. So people had that freedom of information now. Number 8, short and long-term debt cycles are converging. Number 9, on number 8, I'm not going to explain it much, but if those who are familiar with Ray Dalio's work on short and long-term debt cycles know that it goes in waves, so they're all converging now. Number 9, generational cycles. So this is things like the fourth turning. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of it. So to sum it up very shortly, I should say, you have the old saying, strong men create good times create weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men, and obviously the cycle goes around. So at this point, anecdotally, like, ask yourself the question, I think I know where we are. I mean, I think we saw the good times sort of post-World War II, at least economically and socially, we saw a lot of freedom and a lot of economic prosperity. And today, I think we see with like a lot of the woke generation, those weak people creating hard times. And I at least hope for the next generation that those hard times are going to create strong people. Actually, as a matter of fact, I don't even think it's the woke generation. I think we're seeing it now with the fiat Ponzi. I think if you ask yourself as well, is your life becoming easier, right? Or is it becoming harder? And I think it's very clear, at least in my experience and the experience of the people I know, that life is economically and freedom-wise becoming a lot harder. So number 10 is obviously the global power structure, as we talked about, has an immense amount of power in order to be able to implement those agendas that, again, are publicly spoken about on their websites, on their social media accounts. People like Klaus Schwab have written books like The Fourth Industrial Turn-In, The Great Reset, etc., etc. So they have an incredible ability to implement these things. So in 11, a future filled with technocracy and globalism is only going to serve to increase centralization, reduce individual liberty, serve to benefit the very few elites closest to the monetary spigot, and reduce the prosperity of the average person. Number 12 and number 13 sort of all together is when you look, as I was saying just before in a conversation before this, when you look at every empire throughout history, as they become closer to their demise, they become increasingly irrational, increasingly violent, and increasingly desperate to keep their position at the top of the food chain. So as a consequence, any effort to deplatform them is going to be met with stiff militant resistance, right? Which is only natural. It's only human behavior, right? If you're backed into a corner, you're going to die. You're going to lose the prosperity of yourself, your family. You're only going to become more desperate to keep your position there, to keep your family's future. It's only natural. And so the solution to technocracy and globalism is the decentralization and privatization of money. So as we spoke about, two main problems, fiat Ponzi, globalism. So the solution to fake fiat money is hard proof of work money that has real value and can't be manipulated. And the solution to technocracy and globalism, which are the threats to freedom, are privacy tools and technology that can't be stopped. In other words, mathematics, right? The only universal truth we have in this world. And so I'm not a genius, but I would guess, as I'm sure a lot of you guys would guess, that the best tools that you have for a job should be used in order to fix a problem, right? So when we talk about building a long-lasting platform for freedom and prosperity, like maybe you guys have different answers, but I sort of ask myself, like, what are the most important things for myself and my family, right? And if it's not prosperity and freedom, so myself and my family, we can have a good life, and freedom, we can essentially do what we want, I don't know what is. So in regards to fixing those problems, we have proof of work and privacy. And Monero is that method. Monero is decentralized, private, proof of work money. As I say, fix the money, fix the world. They say that a lot in Bitcoin, right? So the last point I believe is Monero provides the best basis we've ever had as a species. to provide a long-lasting platform for freedom and prosperity. So in regards to the move to the Monero standard, I just want to highlight, again, I think I said it before, but I don't actually care about Monero. Like, it's not about Monero at all. It's just that Monero happens to be proof of work and privacy. So it could be anything that has both proof of work and privacy, those technologies that give us the most amount of freedom and prosperity. What does it look like? And I don't like to say this is going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't say this is going to happen or that's going to happen. But as I say, you know, predictable events play out in unpredictable ways. You could have guessed before COVID that, you know, we're going to continue to lose freedom, but nobody here would have guessed that COVID was going to be that measure to lose freedom, right? That's just impossible to predict. So as with any new technology or any new invention, there's new technologies and new inventions every single day. A vast majority of them are not adopted. Why? Because they provide no value to the people in the greater world, to the user. So new technologies are adopted according to the perceived value to the user. Hence why Google is adopted, for example. It's not because we like Google and we're nice people and, you know, we just want Google to succeed. It's because Google actually provides real world value to us in many ways, whether it's through YouTube or started with Google search engines, et cetera, et cetera. So as we see throughout history, right, difficult times often, or almost always, need to happen in order for humans to have the incentive to adopt a new technology. So as a very easy example, we saw radar technology in World War II. It wasn't until the Battle of Britain, where the Germans started bombing England every single day, that they needed to adopt radar technology. So difficult times need to happen in order for humans to have the incentive to adopt new technologies, and in this case, to adopt Monero. As outlined with the fiat Ponzi and the increasing amount of globalism, technocracy, those tough times are coming. So fiat's going to force people to look for alternative monies, and I suppose that dystopian world that we're moving into is going to, again, force those hard times upon people for them to look for new solutions. And just as again, the predictable events play out in unpredictable ways, but we can see patterns in a lot of things throughout history. Mainly one, in the adoption of new technologies, criminals are often the first, again with Bitcoin too, criminals are often the first ones to adopt new technologies. So, and that's true with the car, that's true with guns, that's true with mobile phones. There's 3 recent examples. Because it gave them an advantage over those trying to stop them, i.e. the police. So the continued adoption on the dark nets and black markets is not a reason why people should be scared of it, but it's actually a reason why everybody should trust it and why we actually know it works in the real world. It's not some theoretical bullshit, right? Again, 2 things we see it talked about all the time. You might hear on the propaganda: cash to be banned, CBDCs to be introduced, digital IDs, social credit scores. Again, we can see cultural things, such as increasing concerns about personal or business privacy. If you compare the amount of general attitude towards privacy today, I think between today and 10 years ago, you may or may not agree, but I think today compared to 10 years ago, the concern for personal privacy is night and day. I think many more people are concerned about privacy today than were concerned 10 years ago, for example. Again, might sound crazy if you're not familiar with it, but we've heard people like the World Economic Forum talking about banning meat and salt, for example. Again, carbon credit scores, this whole concern about cow farts destroying the earth, it's actually not that crazy of a thought to think that they are going to try and ban meat, or at least regulate it in a sense of limit it, right? I think we'll see Bitcoin and transparent protocols continue, not only start, but continue to be heavily regulated. I think that's, again, one of the big concerns potentially with the ETF, is that they'll let you own Bitcoin without owning Bitcoin. Again, we're going to see events that lead to less freedom. So people like the Canadian truckers or the Dutch farmers or the Belgian farmers now, being excluded from society and discriminated against for their, essentially in these cases, just their ability to provide for their families. Again, these things don't really matter. Whether adoption happens in small nations like El Salvador for Bitcoin, whether it gets adopted as legal tender like in El Salvador again with Bitcoin, it doesn't actually matter because these tools are designed to provide freedom for people, not to be adopted by those who have traditionally oppressed the people. Again, taxes paid in Monero is again just the same stuff. Like, it's potential that it will happen, but completely not necessary for it to happen. And again, we will see events. We see it in Bitcoin now, but maybe for different reasons. But the example I want to give is in the 1920s, in the Weimar Republic, so modern day Germany. We saw the Weimar Republic go through hyperinflation, right? So over the course of a year, gold might go up 10,000% as government continues printing money, devaluing the mark. People rush to gold irrationally, right? Maybe not even irrationally, but they rush to gold. And then, you know, the politician, they're going to save the day and they're going to introduce some policy which means they stop printing money and make it harder for people to get gold. So as a consequence of supply and demand, the price of gold goes down. So when you actually look at a chart of it, I should have brought a chart, but the amount of volatility in the gold market is actually phenomenal, right? It's up 10,000% one year, down 90% the next year, et cetera, et cetera. But where it all ended up, what was worth one mark at the start was worth around 1 billion marks at the end, right? So point of that number 13 is don't be bullied out of a better financial asset because a lawmaker or someone who's looking to take from you and give to themselves makes it harder for you to do something. So in regards to, finally, I suppose, in regards to like what everybody here can do, right? So the average Joe, certainly someone like me, many of you guys are not developers. You don't have, like myself, any particular, you know, technical skills or whatever. We can do things like a cultural home base. So for crypto, like meetups like this, right? Something like El Salvador in Bitcoin, where you have, what is it, Bitcoin Beach. There's actually, funnily enough, a town in Argentina, I forget the name of it, but it's in the province of Formosa in northern Argentina called Monero Town, and every business there accepts Monero. More books about Monero. Obviously, I've written a book called The Monero Standard. Believe me, if I can do it, I promise you anybody can do it. If you want to do it, that is. It's obviously not easy, but if you want to do it, you can. With things like academic level courses, YouTube videos, you can lobby politicians. Every single one of you can do something like that. Lobby politicians to make more either Monero-friendly, more freedom-friendly laws in general, right? Onboard new users, host more events like tonight, run full nodes, and obviously, I would say not everybody in the world, but a vast, vast, vast majority of you can run nodes and commit hash power to the network. Since Monero is not like Bitcoin after all, Monero is a CPU-dominated, not even dominated, CPU-only mining network. So you can't mine with ASICs like you can on Bitcoin. You can only mine with hardware like you have at home on your laptops. And obviously, if you're a developer, obviously, always more solutions are better. Browser wallets, easy to use, user experience wallets, atomic swaps, DeFi bridges. They exist, but more is always better. Monero-only exchanges, big tech-resistant wallets is actually something I think is going to be very needed in the future. Again, Monero first dominated exchanges and integration with other web applications. And in terms, again, this is something everybody can do. And I think it's vitally important that everybody does do it. Is building a circular economy, right? Because that's how monetary systems get adopted. For example, I wouldn't even blame you if you don't adopt Monero because literally nobody else accepts it. That only makes sense. You'd be stupid to adopt Monero in that regards, as a cash anyway. So everybody can do this. You can have real-world places that accept Monero. If you own a business, you can do it. If you shop at a local grocery, or maybe a fruit shop or a butcher, you can say, okay, I'll go here if you accept Monero. You can pay wages in Monero. You can demand wages in Monero. You can spend Monero on things like food, rent, healthcare, goods, services, community tipping, whatever. Monero VCs, GoFundMe alternatives, Monero markets, which exist, by the way. like eBay and Amazon. There's one called Monero Market, and there's one that actually launched this week where you can buy anything off Amazon in Monero, right? You can have Monero payment company, railway companies, Monero payment rail companies, Monero companies, and yeah, the last one's kind of irrelevant, but partner with human rights organizations. And so, so as I spoke about, many of the concepts I spoke about in the book, we spoke about tonight, but there's actually an incredible amount that we don't speak about, right? Again, to understand these concepts in full depth, you really need to understand, again, economics, finance, the monetary system. You need to understand history, politics, etc., right? So the reason I actually wrote the book, well, the audience I wrote the book for, is not for example, the books I have read in Monero are actually very painful books. They are, like, you need a 10-year PhD in mathematics to even understand them. Like, it's complete bullshit, right? So the target market I was writing this book for is for everybody to understand, for my commie auntie and uncles to understand, for people like my parents who are completely disinterested in anything to do with crypto to understand. So I would say that if any of you guys really want to understand not only more about Monero, again, Monero is completely irrelevant. It's not about Monero. It's about proof of work and privacy in regards to providing a long-lasting platform for freedom and prosperity. I would say grab yourself a copy of the book. It's on monerostandard.com. You can pay in crypto. We're all Aussies here. So Booktopia, which is largest online book site in Australia, it's on there. You can pay in your dirty dollars. So I would say grab yourself a copy. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Girl, thank you so much for getting into morning talk.
Thank you.
Now you shared some great insights. You posed some questions.
Yep.
And I'm sure that some of our friends here would like to ask you a couple of questions.
Go for it.
Who's that, guys? Okay. Deborah. Head on, wait a minute. Got to do some questions. Just watch that little bit just to jump off. So this is Deborah for you. Great presentation, very good. I've been telling everyone, but people just call me conspiracy theorist.
Me too, don't worry.
But anyways, I love the concept for it, and obviously we saw with COVID, they do push back a lot, very aggressively, and so then same with sort of Bitcoin, like anything that's innovative, that's going to take power away from government, institutional stuff, that usually gets shut down to be quick. So what sort of Monero's plan for when that happens to you guys? Because there will be legislation, there will be all sorts of stuff that would try and corner you.
And maybe to add to that, a few hours ago, a certain exchange delisted some Monero pairs, and we've seen a bit of volatility. So maybe even having people actually onboard into the system, what are the tools we can use to get access to this, and how do they stay stay open and stay available. Is that there?
They're on well.
I've got one here. I don't know if that helps. So in regards to the first question, I think we've already seen attacks on Monero, for example. As you just said, a lot of exchanges are delisting Monero. Countries like South Korea are making privacy coins illegal. I think what the most important thing is, kind of like drugs actually, is that it actually works, right? And that's what's going to create demand for it. So as with things that are against the law, if there's always a will, there's a way. And I think, again, we should expect that. We are already seeing it and we should expect it. But I would take that as a sign, if anything, right? If they, for example, allow a Bitcoin ETF, but then ban Monero, what's that really saying, I think that's the signal amongst the noise. So again, as long as Monero always works, I think that's the most important thing. And to come to the second question about how we actually get Monero in that case, right? As you say, it's ever evolving sort of space. This exchange lists it one day and then they don't the next day. So there's always ways you can get it. For example, right now, was it MEXC or MEXC as some people call it? You can do crypto to crypto pairs. There's also a great app actually. I won't show you because it's a bit small. But Cake Wallet, or which is owned by the same people who run Monero.com wallet, you can actually get Monero with AUD. So Cake Wallet, you download that on iOS or Android, and you can obviously get dollars to Monero. But again, there's exchange aggregators. One I use and I recommend to people is called Trocador, is how I pronounce it. Trocado, somehow people pronounce it. And so you put in, it's not only Monero, it's coins like anything like Matic, for example, or Solana or whatever, right? And you can do essentially any of the coins they list to any of the coins they list. So let's say you want to do, just easy example is Bitcoin to Monero. And then it'll come up and it'll show you all the exchanges that have a BTC XMR pair. And you can just put, it shows you the rate. So X amount of BTC per XMR, shows you like the spread, the fees, if any, and you can obviously pick your own through there. So I would say the easiest way, I haven't used Cake Wallet, but I know a lot of people who have. I actually know the guy who owns the wallet, and he's a phenomenal guy. So I would recommend either Cake Wallet, especially in Australia for dollars to XMR, or again, something like Trocador or MEXC, or I think Qcoin also lists Monero crypto to crypto pairs.
So in case thing, and I run in here,
And you break it down. Sell one.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do that obviously myself, but a lot of people don't want to. Like, I've used that example to people, and obviously people have a lot going on in their lives, you know? Not everyone can just sell something from an area, you know?
All right. And just hand this over.
Yeah.
In hand, the permanent state. And why only proof of work if not proof of stake?
Great question, yeah.
Just a moment for a second. Things.
Yeah, so there's a lot of new ones, but I can sum it up kind of simply. So in a mining capacity, I think for what it's worth, proof of work and proof of stake work more or less the same. The big difference is when it comes to governance, right? So on a proof of stake protocol, you go on like the voting dashboard. By the way, a vast majority of proof of stake coins are pre-mined, so they already own over half the team or whatever already owns a large percentage or over half the percentage of coins. But the point being is that I don't believe that proof of stake proof of stake protocols are adequately decentralized to stand up to something like a nation state attack. So when you actually think about the concept of like a publicly listed company, for example, listed on the Australian Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ or whatever, that's actually what they are. They are pre-mined, as in they create a company, they have the shares themselves, and they're proof of stake, i.e. whoever has the most voting power has the most amount of voting. So when you talk about a decentralized monetary protocol with the ability to, again, by reserve banks and governments to create money out of thin air, essentially what it comes down to is the more money you have, the more influence you have, which is what I would say the current system is today.
would anyone else like to ask Michael a question? Come on, Dion, you've got it at one. And then we bursting over there. Here's one. Yep, thank you.
So you felt.
Thank you, Michael. That was actually really interesting. Actually, never heard of it. So I found, and I think you obviously really passionate about what you do and have incredible knowledge. So I'm just a little bit curious about a couple of things. So you obviously love that website with all of the statistics from the US and the economics. So one of the things that kind of jumped out at me when you were presenting that, because obviously when we are making a decision about a lot of stuff, you're doing it based on the information that's in front of you. And even though maths is amazing, math is also an ability to create a lot of lies and statistics and presentations of numbers to then make a whole lot of decisions. So from a productivity that you're referring to, there's a lot of people that are not registered in the US that don't count, but their productivity, their money, their flow, and the workforce is still real.
Such as?
Well, how many illegal immigrants currently live in the US that don't actually have an ID? Probably 10%.
They're also not paying tax though.
It doesn't mean that the productivity of the contribution to the economy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
So I think just from that point of view. So what I do pick up in the tone, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. This is obviously a very Western-centric mindset. With the Western, you refer up a lot of the US or Europe. But we do live in a big world where actually the bulk of the growth of the economy of the world, the population growth, is all coming from Asia. So how does Monero look in those individuals, and actually the many Australians who don't have a home, who live in a different kind of system that, where there is this exchange. So what does that actually look like for the everyday person to actually reach this?
Do you mean like just in Asia or?
I like it. And this preparing this. What makes Simon Crowett a very wealthy in the food lines that kind of crowds miles there and buying food. That's the one that.
Yeah, the reason I. Sure. So the reason I use basically Western data, it's actually primarily American data, is because the US dollar is the reserve currency for the world, and obviously the global powerhouse and the biggest monetary system, et cetera. In regards to other countries, I think the most important thing to take away is that what the monetary system in America is based on everywhere else in the world, which again is just thin air. It's just paper that is, again, fiat by decree, right? So I would say what it looks like for, again, people in Asia or Africa is pretty much the same as it looks like for everybody else. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Yeah, sure.
I'm just really curious that we've done two conversations. One is with super digital world, it's amazing encouraging, which is the current is what is the thing going through and being on time to worry. And then you actually have us being trapped the world with one even being the more kind. So it was.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I like better than someone else.
If we need something, that's actually, if you need to know about very little, the other. And such, I am really curious about that bit because there are many places where you don't pass my mind. So you've done a couple weeks, like most of the company going to start, so they still.
Yep.
There's actually lots of places where at the moment it's not even the normal about and allowing this.
Yeah. So I think sort of good points is it's about sort of the, obviously we're hinting at like the ability to be included in a monetary system, right? So obviously with fiat, as you're well aware, many people are like kicked out or not allowed in the system, Swiss system, et cetera. The base limitation to every cryptocurrency is the ability to have a wallet, right? So it's just the base. Once you have the ability to have a wallet, which the easiest form is a mobile wallet, that's obviously solved. But that's obviously the problem I wouldn't even call it a problem because I don't have the exact data. If I had to guess, I would say 80 to 90% of the world has a mobile phone and has the ability to have a cryptocurrency wallet on there. And the people who don't have a phone currently, like as we look at trends, obviously, everything in life is a process, not an event, right? So you don't go from 0 to 100 overnight. And obviously, as we're seeing with, as we talk about in the book, is adoption curves and technological adoption curves. With mobile phones, you have your typical sort of early adopters who get in early, like with crypto, semi where we are now, start going parabolic with the main population. And then you have sort of curves out as an S where you get the laggards. So like say old people is a generic sort of term. So when we look at like something like mobile phones, I think it's fair to say since mobile phones and especially smartphones have been out for a while now, I think we're sort of getting to that S thing. But again, nothing is 0 and then 100. So I think everything being a process, this is just where we are in the process for right or wrong. But I think, yeah, 80, 90%, but I don't have the data. So.
Pretty low and a great enough.
Thanks for a great presentation. So
Why do you think the governments, like, what are the governments the most scared of around Monero privacy coins? Like, why is that the one that's been banned when we're slowly starting to get adoption around crypto? What do you think the government agenda is that it really dislikes privacy coin?
I sort of think the main driver for it has been the success that it's had on the dark net. So when you talk about the ability for criminals to launder money, right? So what was Bitcoin now is Monero. Back in the day, obviously, as I said, back in 2015 when I got into Bitcoin, that's what the primary currency on the dark net was. Most people didn't even know what Bitcoin was. Crypto exchanges were sort of amateur at best, if you know what I mean. Very sort of, certainly not what we have today with full 24-hour. I mean, there was full 24-hour markets, but there's a lot of inefficiencies in the market and a lot of different options and ways to buy it. So I think the main driver for sort of the attack on privacy coins and obviously Monero has been, again, that sort of AML, was it counter-terrorist financing sort of view that they take on it, whereas obviously they can't trace it. That's, for example, where I think Zcash comes unstuck, because Zcash has an important distinction is Zcash is transparent by default with optional privacy, and Monero is private by default with optional transparency. So Zcash is kind of, I might be going off topic here, but Zcash is kind of like bend the knee to regulators in order to get listed on exchanges, for example. And that's why we see like Zcash on exchanges until very recently, the last month, and Monero obviously banned, is I really think from that point of view, is they need to know and they want to know, essentially, it's cliche to say, but I think they really want to know every aspect of your life. And I think it's just part of that process that as an empire becomes closer to demise, they just become increasingly rational and desperate. And I think that's just I think it's very true with the Bitcoin ETF too. That's one of their attempts to control it. But that privacy really, as opposed to Bitcoin, provides a real threat to, I suppose it gives the power back to the individual on a level where I don't think the state's comfortable having it. But it's also from I don't think it's some grand conspiracy that they hate privacy and they want to control everything. I think it's also a basic sort of reflex reaction to something like AML regulations that we see where they can't control it, so they ban it, I think it can also be that simple. No, thanks.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Terrific questions, everyone. And what a great night it's been. Please put hands together for Michael Fitzgerald.